The morning had started just like any other. The sun was only beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. The streets were quiet except for the low hum of engines and the chirping of early birds. A young woman named Claire was driving home after a long night shift at the small-town clinic where she worked as a nurse. Her eyes were tired, but her heart felt light. She had helped deliver a baby that night, and that always left her with a strange kind of peace, the feeling that maybe the world wasn't such a bad place after all. She rolled down the window to let the cool morning air hit her face, hoping it would keep her awake until she got home. Her favorite song played softly on the radio. Everything felt calm, almost too calm, the kind of quiet that comes before something you don't expect. As she slowed down at a red light near the edge of town, she noticed a car speeding from the opposite direction. It was a silver SUV, swerving slightly as if the driver had lost control. Her heart jumped. The sound that came next made her stomach drop. A loud, crushing noise followed by a burst of sparks. The SUV slammed into a guardrail and came to a violent stop. For a second, everything froze. Then she saw smoke curling out from under the hood. Without thinking, she pulled her car to the side and jumped out. There were no other cars around yet, no one else to help. Her shoes hit the pavement hard as she ran toward the wrecked vehicle. The smell of gasoline filled the air, sharp and choking. The front of the car was completely crushed, and small flames had already started near the engine. Her hand shook as she tried the driver's door, but it wouldn't budge. Through the cracked glass, she could barely make out a man slumped over the steering wheel. He wasn't moving. Panic started to rise in her chest, but then, faintly, she heard another sound. A small, muffled cry coming from the back seat. Her breath caught. There was a child inside. "Hold on," she shouted, though she doubted anyone could hear her. She moved to the back of the car and peered through the window. Inside, strapped into a car seat, was a little boy, maybe 2 years old. His face red from crying, his tiny hands waving helplessly in the air. The smoke inside the car was getting thicker. Claire's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She tried the back door, but it was jammed too. She looked around frantically for something to break the window with. On the ground, she spotted a small rock, grabbed it, and slammed it against the glass. The first hit did nothing. She hit it again, harder this time, and finally the window shattered with a sharp crack. Broken glass scattered over her arms, cutting her skin, but she didn't care. She reached inside, coughing from the smoke, and began fumbling with the seatbelt. The child's cries grew weaker, his eyes half closed from the fumes. "Come on, sweetheart, stay with me," she whispered, her voice trembling. The belt was stuck, melted slightly from the heat. She used her keys to pry it loose, ignoring the sting of the hot metal on her fingers. Finally, with one hard pull, the strap gave way. She grabbed the toddler, holding him close against her chest, and pulled him out through the broken window. The moment they were free, a louder crack came from the car, the sound of the fire growing. She stumbled backward, clutching the child as the flames shot higher. The heat hit her face like a wave. Her lungs burned from the smoke, but she didn't stop until she was several feet away. She fell to her knees on the grass by the side of the road, gasping for air. The little boy started crying again, coughing and clinging to her shirt. She checked his face and a few small scratches, a bit of soot, but he was alive. She held him tighter, tears streaming down her own cheeks now, not from the smoke but from relief. Behind her, the sound of sirens began to rise in the distance. Someone must have called for help. She looked up and saw a few cars stopping, people running over. One man shouted, "Is anyone else inside?" "The driver," she managed to say, her throat raw. "He's still in there." 2 men ran toward the burning car. One of them had a fire extinguisher from his truck, but the flames were too strong. Claire stood there helplessly, watching as they tried to reach the driver. Within moments, firefighters arrived, their equipment hissing and shouting, filling the air. A paramedic rushed to her side. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She shook her head quickly. "The baby. He was inside. Please check him first." The paramedic took the child from her arms, wrapping him in a small blanket and checking his breathing. "He's okay," the man said with a gentle smile. "You did good. You saved him." Those words didn't quite sink in. Her mind felt fuzzy, her ears ringing from the noise and the rush of adrenaline. She sat there staring at the smoke rising into the sky. The child's tiny fingers had left smudges of soot on her arms. She could still feel the heat from the fire on her skin, the smell of gasoline stuck in her hair. After a few minutes, another paramedic guided her toward an ambulance. She didn't want to go, but they insisted on checking her burns and the cuts on her hands. Inside, she watched as they placed the boy on a stretcher beside her. He had stopped crying now, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. "Do you know him?" the paramedic asked. "No," she said softly. "I just saw the crash." He gave her a look that was part amazement, part disbelief. Not many people would have gone in there like that. "You're lucky to be alive," she smiled weakly. "So is he." The ride to the hospital felt long. Claire kept looking at the child, wondering where his parents were, who they might be. She hoped the man in the driver's seat would make it, but a heavy silence hung over the ambulance. No one said much after that. When they reached the hospital, reporters were already outside, drawn by the sound of sirens and smoke visible from miles away. The paramedics shielded her as they brought her in. Nurses she knew from other departments recognized her immediately. "Claire? What happened?" One of them asked, shocked to see her covered in soot and blood. "There was a crash," she said simply. "He was inside." She nodded toward the child. Doctors rushed to check the little boy while another nurse cleaned Claire's wounds. Her hands were trembling as she sat on the hospital bed, trying to piece together what had just happened. It all felt unreal, like something she'd only seen in movies. A police officer came in to take her statement. He asked her about the crash, what she saw, and how she managed to get the child out. She answered everything quietly, her voice steady but tired. When he finished, he said, "You did something extraordinary today. The driver's still being treated, but that boy, he wouldn't have made it without you." She nodded, though she didn't feel like a hero. She had acted on instinct, nothing more. If she'd stopped to think, she might have been too scared to move. Hours later, as the adrenaline faded, exhaustion hit her. Her arms ached. Her lungs still burned slightly from the smoke. Yet she couldn't stop thinking about the child, his soft cry, the way he'd clung to her when she pulled him out. She wondered who he was, who his parents were, and whether they knew yet what had happened. When she finally left the hospital that evening, the sun was setting again, a full circle from the morning when it all began. Reporters were still waiting outside, trying to ask questions, but she slipped quietly past them. She didn't want attention. She just wanted to go home, take a shower, and let her body rest. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the image of that little boy's face. She had no idea that the man in the car, the man she thought might not survive, was one of the most powerful figures in the city. Someone whose life was about to collide with hers in ways she could never imagine. For now, she only knew that she had done what her heart told her to do, and even though she was exhausted and sore, there was a strange calm in her chest. She had saved a life that day, and deep down she felt that maybe her own life had changed too, in ways she couldn't yet understand. The next morning came quietly, though nothing felt quiet inside her anymore. Claire barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the burning car, the thick smoke, the child's terrified face. She could still hear the sirens in her ears and feel the sting of heat against her skin. Her arms were wrapped in bandages now, her fingers covered with small cuts. The doctor had told her to rest, but her mind wouldn't stop spinning. The news was everywhere. When she turned on the television, every channel seemed to be talking about the same thing. Mysterious nurse saves child from fiery crash. Her picture, taken outside the hospital, flashed on the screen. She hadn't even realized someone had taken it. She looked tired and pale, her eyes hollow but calm. The headline made her stomach twist. She didn't feel like the person in that photo. She didn't feel like a hero. She reached for the remote and turned it off. The silence that followed was heavy. Outside her window, the morning sun was bright, but her apartment felt dim. She sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Her phone buzzed again and again. Messages from coworkers, old friends, and people she hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone was saying how brave she was, how proud they felt, how they couldn't believe what she had done. She replied politely to a few, but then set her phone aside. She didn't know how to respond to praise for something she hadn't even thought about doing. She went back to the clinic that afternoon because she couldn't stand sitting at home. Her supervisor tried to send her home again, saying she needed rest, but Claire promised to take it easy and only help with paperwork. Everyone kept looking at her differently, with admiration and curiosity. Around lunchtime, a nurse came running in and whispered something to the receptionist. The room went quiet. Then the nurse turned to Claire and said softly, "Someone's here to see you." She looked up, confused. "Who?" Before anyone could answer, the door opened. A tall man stepped inside wearing a dark suit and a look that instantly drew attention. There was something commanding about him, the kind of presence that made the air around him seem heavier. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes searched the room until they found her. Claire froze. She had seen that face before, not in person but on television, in newspapers, and on billboards around the city. Jonathan Reynolds. The name echoed in her head. The CEO of one of the biggest companies in the country. A man known for his wealth, his sharp decisions, and his quiet private life. Now he stood right there in the small-town clinic, out of place among the pastel walls and soft beeping of medical machines. He walked toward her slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. Behind him were two bodyguards who stayed by the door, silent and still. "Are you Claire?" His voice was deep, calm, but there was a tremor beneath it. A strain she could hear. "Yes," she said quietly, unsure what else to say. He nodded, his jaw tightening as he looked at her. "You were the one who pulled my son out of that car." The words hung in the air for a moment. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. She nodded again. "I was there, yes. He's okay, isn't he?" His expression softened just slightly. "He's fine. They said if you hadn't gotten him out when you did." He didn't finish the sentence. His eyes glistened for just a second before he blinked it away. "You saved his life." Claire looked down, unsure how to handle the weight of his words. "I just did what I could," she said. He studied her face quietly for a few seconds, then said, "May I speak to you privately?" She hesitated but nodded. Her supervisor gestured toward the small break room. Jonathan followed her in, closing the door behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt small compared to the power he carried with him. Yet when he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost fragile. "I don't usually find myself at a loss for words," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "But I don't know how to thank you. My son, he's all I have left." She frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. He looked up then, and there was a sadness in his eyes she hadn't expected. "My wife passed away 2 years ago. Since then, it's just been me and him. When I got that call..." His voice cracked for the first time. He took a breath and looked at her again. "I thought I'd lost him too." Her chest tightened. For the first time, she saw not the powerful businessman, but a father, scared, broken, and human. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I can't imagine how that must have felt." He nodded slowly. "You don't have to imagine it. You changed it. You changed everything." She didn't know what to say. Gratitude wasn't something she knew how to handle when it came this heavy. She tried to brush it off, but he stopped her gently. "Please," he said, his tone firm but not cold. "Let me do something for you, anything. Tell me what you need. Money, opportunity, support, anything you ask for, it's yours." The words caught her off guard. She stared at him, trying to understand if he was serious. "I don't want anything," she said finally. He tilted his head slightly. "Everyone wants something." "Not me," she replied quietly. "I just wanted the boy to be safe. That's all." For a long moment he didn't speak. The silence stretched between them, filled with something that wasn't awkward, just real. Then unexpectedly he smiled, not a wide smile but one that softened the edges of his face. "You're different," he said. "Most people, when they see something like that, they freeze. They look away, but you ran toward the fire." "I didn't think," she said honestly. "I just moved." He nodded again. "That's what makes it even more remarkable." A knock came on the door. One of the bodyguards peeked in, reminding him he had a meeting waiting. Jonathan nodded slightly, then turned back to her. "I won't forget this," he said quietly, "and I won't let you disappear into the background. You saved my son's life. That means you're part of ours now, whether you like it or not." She gave a nervous laugh. "That's not necessary." But he was already reaching into his jacket, taking out a small card. "This has my direct number. If you ever need anything, and anything at all, you call me." She hesitated before taking it. The card was plain, just his name embossed in silver letters, but it felt heavier than it looked. After he left, the entire clinic buzzed with whispers. Everyone had seen him. Everyone wanted to know what he said. Claire kept quiet. She just sat there staring at the card in her hand, feeling like her life had somehow shifted in a way she couldn't quite explain. That evening, as she walked home, she thought about him, the way his voice had cracked when he talked about his wife, the way his eyes softened when he mentioned his son. He wasn't at all what she expected from someone so powerful. There was something raw, something lonely in him. When she got home, she found a basket waiting at her door. Inside was a bouquet of white lilies, a thank you note, and a small stuffed bear holding a card that said, "From Ethan." Her heart melted instantly. She sat down on her couch holding the bear, and for the first time since the accident, she smiled without sadness behind it. The next few days were a blur. Reporters tried to find her again, but she avoided them. She just wanted life to go back to normal, but somehow it couldn't. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. Even at the grocery store, strangers stopped her to say thank you. She appreciated it, but part of her wished she could fade back into quiet. Then 3 days later, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something told her to answer. "Claire?" The voice on the other end was calm, familiar. "Mr. Reynolds? I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "I wanted to ask if you'd visit the hospital. My son keeps asking about the lady who saved him." Her heart warmed instantly. "Of course," she said. "I'd love to." That afternoon, she drove to the city hospital where security led her upstairs. When she entered the room, the little boy was sitting up in bed, clutching a toy car. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "Hi there," she said softly, kneeling beside the bed. "You look so much better." He smiled shyly and reached out his small hand. She took it gently. Jonathan watched from the side, his face unreadable but peaceful. "He hasn't smiled like that since before the accident," he said quietly. Claire looked at the child again, then back at him. "He's strong," she said. "You should be proud." "I am," he replied, his voice warm. "And I owe that strength to you." They talked for a while after that, about his recovery, about how long he'd need to stay in the hospital, about her work at the clinic. Jonathan listened more than he spoke, asking questions not like a businessman, but like someone genuinely curious. When she finally stood to leave, the little boy clung to her arm and said, "Don't go." She laughed softly. "I'll come back, okay?" Jonathan smiled. "I think he's made that decision for you." As she walked out of the hospital that day, she realized something had shifted again. What had started as a tragic accident was slowly turning into a connection she didn't see coming. She didn't know what it meant yet or where it would lead, but deep down, she knew one thing. Their lives had crossed for a reason, and somehow, she had a feeling this was only the beginning. The next few days passed quietly, though nothing about them felt normal anymore. Claire tried to return to her routine at the clinic, but something inside her had shifted. The crash, the rescue, the visit from the powerful man, and that small child's smile. They lingered in her thoughts every waking hour. Every morning, she'd check her phone half expecting another message from him, though she told herself she shouldn't. She didn't know why she cared so much. Maybe it was because she still worried about the boy's recovery. Maybe it was something else, something she couldn't quite name. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, just as she was finishing her shift, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an unknown number. "Good evening, Claire. This is Jonathan Reynolds. My son keeps asking when he'll see you again. Would you have dinner with us tomorrow? Somewhere quiet." She read the message twice, her heart thudding. A part of her hesitated. She wasn't used to being around people like him, people whose names opened doors wherever they went. But another part of her couldn't ignore the invitation. The image of the little boy's smile flashed in her mind, and she found herself typing a simple reply. "I'd love to, thank you." The next evening, she stood outside a quiet restaurant tucked away on a narrow street lined with trees. The lights glowed warm through the windows. When she stepped inside, the host immediately led her to a private section in the back. Jonathan was already there, sitting at a round table. He looked different without the sharpness of his usual suit. His jacket was off, sleeves rolled up slightly, his expression more relaxed than before. Beside him sat his son, dressed neatly in a small blue shirt, holding the same stuffed bear she'd received days ago. When the boy saw her, his face lit up. "You came," he said, his small voice full of excitement. "I did," she said, smiling as she took a seat beside him. "I promised, didn't I?" Jonathan looked at her quietly for a moment, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "He's been talking about you nonstop. You're his favorite person right now." She laughed lightly. "That's an honor." Dinner was simple but warm. They talked about little things. The boy's favorite toys, his favorite songs, his fear of thunderstorms. Jonathan listened to every word his son said with a patience that softened his otherwise serious face. At one point, the boy asked, "Daddy, are you friends with her now?" Jonathan looked at Claire, then back at his son. "I think so," he said. "If she wants to be." Claire smiled. "I'd like that." For a moment, silence hung between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that felt safe. As the evening went on, she began to see another side of him. He wasn't just the powerful man everyone talked about on TV, the one who made headlines for his business decisions. He was just a father trying to hold things together, still learning how to raise a child on his own. When the boy spilled his drink, Jonathan didn't get angry. He just laughed softly and cleaned it up himself. There was something deeply human in that. After dinner, they walked outside together. The rain had stopped, and the streets shimmered under the glow of streetlights. The boy held Claire's hand as they walked toward the waiting car. "Can we see you again?" he asked. She looked down at him. "We'll see," she said with a smile. "You have to rest and get strong first." Jonathan watched them quietly, and when she finally said goodbye, he thanked her again, not just for coming, but for being there. That night, as she drove home, she couldn't stop thinking about the dinner. She'd expected it to be awkward, formal, maybe even intimidating, but it wasn't. It felt warm, almost normal, like something that belonged in her life even though it shouldn't. Over the next few weeks, they saw each other more often. Sometimes she'd visit the boy at the hospital or the park. Other times, Jonathan would stop by the clinic to bring her lunch, saying it was just a small thank you. She noticed that he always asked about her day, about her patients, about how she was really doing. Most people didn't ask those things and actually mean them. He listened, not with polite interest, but with genuine care. Slowly, an unspoken understanding began to grow between them. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was something deeper and quieter, built on gratitude, kindness, and shared moments of simple honesty. One evening, he called her unexpectedly. His voice was lower than usual, strained. "Are you free?" he asked. I don't want to be alone tonight." There was something in his tone that made her pause. "Of course," she said gently. "Where are you?" He told her to come to a small park by the river, a place she knew well. When she arrived, she found him sitting on a bench, staring out at the water. His son was asleep in the stroller beside him. She sat down quietly next to him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The night air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the space between them. Finally, he said, "Today was my wife's birthday." Her heart tightened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded, eyes still on the water. "She used to bring him here all the time." He doesn't remember her, not really. Sometimes I think that's a blessing, and sometimes it feels like another loss. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, letting his words breathe in the quiet. Then she said softly, "She'd be proud of how you've taken care of him." He gave a small, sad smile. "Some days I don't feel like I'm doing enough." "You're doing your best," she said. "And that's more than enough." He looked at her then, really looked, as if her words had touched something he hadn't let anyone near for a long time. "You talk like someone who's seen a lot of hurt," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "You can't work in a clinic without seeing it, but you also see the strength that comes after it." Something about that moment shifted the air between them. It wasn't romantic or dramatic, it was just real. Two people sitting in the dark, sharing pieces of their lives neither had planned to share. After that night, their connection deepened. He began inviting her to spend more time with his son, small picnics, walks in the park, or quiet dinners at home. The boy grew attached to her quickly, always excited when she arrived. Sometimes he'd run into her arms the moment she stepped through the door. Jonathan watched those moments with quiet gratitude. There was warmth in his eyes every time he looked at her, the kind that said thank you without needing words. But not everyone understood their friendship. People around him started to whisper. Reporters tried to spin stories about the mysterious woman who had suddenly entered his life. He ignored them, but she couldn't. One day at the clinic, a journalist showed up pretending to be a patient. When she realized what was happening, she asked him to leave. That night, she called Jonathan, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't like this," she said. "I didn't ask for attention. I just wanted to help." "I know," he said gently. "I'll take care of it. You shouldn't have to deal with this because of me." True to his word, he made a public statement the next day asking for privacy and respect. The media attention began to fade, though whispers never truly went away. Despite the noise outside, the quiet moments between them stayed the same. They'd talk about ordinary things, favorite books, childhood memories, small dreams. He told her how he used to paint before business took over his life. She told him how she'd once wanted to travel the world but stayed because her mother needed care. One evening, as she was leaving his house after dinner, he walked her to her car. The street was quiet, the porch light casting a soft glow. "Claire," he said suddenly. She turned to look at him. "I keep thinking about that day," he said. "How everything could have ended so differently. I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything," she said softly. "You already gave me something and perspective." "I think I needed that as much as you did," he smiled faintly. "You always say the right thing." She laughed gently. "No, I just say what's true." For a long moment they stood there in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Then she said goodnight and he watched her drive away, the taillights fading into the dark. That night, lying in bed, Claire stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened since that morning of the crash. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted. What began as an act of instinct had turned into something far deeper, a connection that now felt impossible to walk away from. She didn't know what the future would bring, or whether the path ahead would be easy. But one thing she knew for certain, their lives were no longer separate, and somehow, even with all the uncertainty, that thought didn't scare her. It felt right, like something that was always meant to happen. The waiting area outside the intensive care unit was quiet except for the steady beep of machines coming from inside and the distant echo of footsteps on the hospital floor. The young woman sat there with both her hands wrapped in bandages, her clothes still faintly smelling of smoke. She hadn't spoken much since being brought in. Everything had happened so fast that her mind hadn't caught up yet. She stared at the floor, lost in thought, her heart still pounding from the memory of that burning car. The image of the little boy's face, covered in soot but still breathing, replayed in her mind again and again. She couldn't stop wondering how he was doing. The nurses had taken him in for tests after she handed him over. They said he'd be okay, but she needed to hear it again to believe it. The automatic doors slid open suddenly and the hallway filled with the sound of quick footsteps. She looked up and saw a group of men walking toward the ICU. In the middle of them was a tall man wearing a dark suit. His face was pale and his eyes were searching for something. Someone. That man was the boy's father. He moved like someone who didn't have time to breathe, like the world might collapse if he didn't reach his child fast enough. People in the hallway turned to look at him. There was something about his presence that made everyone step aside automatically. His clothes, his expression, his composure, even in panic. He carried a kind of power that didn't need words. When the nurse stopped him and explained that his son was stable and under observation, his shoulders seemed to loosen slightly. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Then he asked the question that had been burning in his chest. Who rescued him? The nurse looked around and pointed toward the young woman sitting in the corner. The man's gaze followed her finger. For a moment he just stood there, studying the small figure in the chair. Her hair was messy, her face streaked with smoke and exhaustion. She looked fragile but calm, like someone who had seen something terrible and was still trying to make sense of it. He walked toward her slowly. His polished shoes made soft sounds against the floor. She didn't notice him at first. Her mind was still somewhere else. But when she looked up and saw him standing there, she straightened in her seat, unsure of what to say. "You were the one," he said quietly. His voice was deep but steady, filled with something that was both gratitude and disbelief. She nodded, unsure how to respond. I just did what I could," she said softly. The man looked at her hands wrapped in thick white bandages, and then back at her face. "You went into a burning car," he said slowly, as if trying to understand it himself. "For a child you didn't even know." She glanced down at her hands and shook her head slightly. "There wasn't time to think. I just saw him and I couldn't walk away." For a few seconds he said nothing. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. The weight of everything, fear, relief, shock, was written all over his face. Finally he spoke again. "You saved my son's life," he said firmly. "You saved the only thing that matters to me." Her throat tightened at his words. She hadn't expected him to say it like that. He sounded like a man who rarely spoke about emotions, but right now, the walls around him were gone. "I don't even know your name," he said after a pause. "It's Lily," she said quietly. He repeated it, almost to himself, "Lily." Then, after a long silence, he looked at her with an intensity that made her nervous. "Tell me what you want," he said. "Anything. Whatever it is, I'll make it happen." She blinked, caught completely off guard. "What?" He took a step closer. "Anything. Money, a job, a house, whatever you want." "You risked your life for my son. I owe you everything." Lily shook her head, almost in panic. No, please don't say that. I don't want anything. Really, I didn't do it for a reward." He frowned slightly as if he didn't understand. "There has to be something." "There isn't," she said firmly, though her voice trembled a little. "I'm just glad he's alive." Her words hung in the air between them. For a moment the man just stood there, silent. Then unexpectedly his expression softened. "No one else went near that car," he said in a low voice. "Everyone was standing there watching, and you ran straight into the fire." Lily looked down. "Anyone would have done the same." He gave a faint, almost bitter smile. "You'd be surprised how few would." There was something about the way he said it that made her heart ache a little. This man, who seemed so powerful and unshakable, sounded suddenly human, even fragile. A nurse came out of the ICU and told him that his son was awake. He turned toward the door, then hesitated and looked back at her. "Please don't leave yet," he said softly. She nodded, though she wasn't sure why he wanted her to stay. He disappeared into the ICU. Through the glass window, Lily could see him kneeling beside the bed, holding his son's tiny hand. The boy looked sleepy but alive, his small chest rising and falling steadily. The man bent forward, his forehead resting against the side of the bed. Watching that moment made Lily's eyes fill with tears. She hadn't realized how deeply this had affected her until then. It wasn't just relief. It was something more, a strange sense of connection to people she didn't even know. After some time, he came back out. The hard lines of his face had softened. He walked over and sat in the chair beside her, surprising her again. "He's going to be fine," he said quietly. "The doctors say he's strong." "That's good," she said with a tired smile. He studied her for a while. "Do you have family here?" She shook her head. "Just me." There was a brief silence. Then he spoke again. "You must have been terrified." She exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting to the floor. "Honestly, I didn't think. It was like my body moved before my mind did. I only started shaking after it was over." He nodded as if understanding that kind of shock. "I've faced business crises, political pressure, even threats before," he said quietly. "But nothing has ever scared me like that phone call. They told me my car had crashed and my son was inside. I don't even remember the drive here." Lily listened silently. She didn't know what to say to something like that. He rubbed his face with his hand as if trying to process everything. "If you hadn't been there." He stopped mid-sentence. The thought was too heavy to finish. She reached out slightly, then hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate. "He's okay now," she said softly. "That's what matters." He looked at her, eyes glistening for the first time. "Thank you," he said simply. "Those 2 words don't feel enough, but they're all I have right now." She smiled faintly. "They're enough." They sat there for a long time, not saying much. The world outside the hospital went on as usual, but in that small waiting area everything felt still. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt awkward. It was quiet understanding. Eventually, a nurse came to check on Lily's hands. The man stood up and offered to help her up. His tone had changed. It was no longer formal or distant. "Let me at least make sure you get home safely," he said. She started to protest, but then she saw the genuine concern in his eyes and decided not to argue. "Okay," she said quietly. He called his driver and they walked through the hospital corridors together. People stared. They recognized him, but no one dared to interrupt. Outside, a sleek black car was waiting. The driver opened the door and Lily hesitated before getting in. "Please," he said gently. "Just this once. You've done enough alone today." Something in his voice made her agree. As the car drove through the quiet streets, neither of them spoke much. The city lights reflected on the windows, flickering across their faces. For Lily, it all felt unreal. This morning she was just a tired nurse heading home. and now she was sitting beside one of the most powerful men in the city. When the car stopped near her small apartment building, she turned to thank him. "You really didn't have to do this," she said. "I wanted to," he replied simply. Then after a short pause, he added, "Lily, I meant what I said earlier. I want to do something for you. Please don't refuse right now, just think about it." She looked at him, unsure how to respond. His tone wasn't demanding, it was gentle, almost pleading. "I'll think about it," she said finally. He gave a small nod, and for the first time, a faint smile touched his face. "Good." As she stepped out of the car, the cool night air brushed her skin. She stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear down the street. Her mind was a mix of exhaustion, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite name. Inside her small apartment, she sat by the window, her hands aching but her heart strangely full. She thought about the little boy, about the father's eyes when he said thank you. About the fire, the fear, the relief. She didn't know it yet, but that night had changed everything for her, for him, and for the child whose life had brought them together in the most unexpected way. Days passed and life slowly began to settle down again. Though for Lily, nothing truly felt the same. She had returned to work at the hospital, trying to resume her regular shifts. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw that burning car, that small face she had pulled from danger, and those eyes of the man who had thanked her with such deep emotion. Her co-workers often came by to ask how she was feeling. Some had seen her story on the local news, where reporters had called her a heroic nurse who saved a powerful businessman's child. But she never liked that word, hero. She didn't feel like one. She had done what anyone should do. That was all. Still, there was no escaping the attention. One morning, when she arrived at the hospital, she found a group of journalists waiting near the entrance. They tried to ask questions, to get her to share every detail of that day. She just smiled politely, said she had nothing more to add, and hurried inside. Inside, things felt a little calmer. Her manager had told everyone to give her space, but even so, people looked at her differently now, with admiration, respect, even a bit of awe. She wasn't used to that. She just wanted her quiet life back. That afternoon, as she was leaving work, she found a familiar car waiting outside. It was sleek black and stood out among the others. The driver stepped out and opened the back door. "Miss Lily," he said politely, "Mr. Reynolds would like to see you if you have a moment." She hesitated. She hadn't heard from him since that night. He had texted once to thank her again, saying his son was recovering well, but she hadn't expected to see him again. After a moment, she nodded and got in the car. The drive was silent except for the low hum of the engine. When they reached his office building, she was guided up to a top-floor suite with large glass windows overlooking the city. He was standing by the window when she entered, hands in his pockets, staring out at the skyline. When he turned around, he smiled faintly. "You came," he said softly. "I wasn't sure if I should," she admitted. "I'm glad you did." He gestured for her to sit. "I've been meaning to see you in person again, but I wanted to give you time first." The media attention was a bit much. She nodded, sitting across from him. "It's okay. It'll pass soon, I think." He studied her for a moment before speaking. "You know, I've spent years building companies, running projects, managing people. I thought I had control over everything. But that day, everything changed. All the money, the power, none of it could do what you did in those few seconds." She didn't know what to say, so she stayed quiet. He smiled slightly. "I've thought a lot about what to give you, something that actually matters. But every idea I had seemed too small." "Please," she said quickly, "I don't want anything. I told you before." He raised his hand gently. "I know, and I respect that. But I also know that people like you never think of themselves first. You help everyone else, and you never ask for help in return." Lily looked down, unsure how to respond. "I don't want to repay you with money," he continued. "I want to give you a chance. A different kind of life if you ever want it. You're a nurse. You spend your life taking care of others. I've been working on a new foundation to support hospitals, especially for children. I want you to be part of it, not as a volunteer, but as someone who helps shape it." Her eyes widened slightly. "Me?" "Yes, you've seen what happens when help arrives too late. You know what it means to act when it matters. I want people like that guiding this project." Lily blinked, taken aback. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," he said kindly. She nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll think about it." He smiled again, and for a moment the atmosphere softened. He asked how she was healing, how her hands were. She showed him the fading bandages, and he nodded approvingly. Then they talked about his son, how the boy was laughing again, sleeping well, and even asking for the lady with the bright voice who pulled him out of the car. That made Lily laugh softly for the first time in days.
He remembered that?
He did, the man said, smiling warmly. He said you told him everything would be okay. He keeps saying it now when he gets scared. Something in her chest warmed. I'm glad he's doing better. They talked for a while longer, and when she left that evening, she felt a strange mix of peace and confusion. She wasn't used to someone of his status treating her with such quiet respect. It wasn't pride or charity. It was genuine gratitude. Weeks passed, and life found a new rhythm. Lily kept working at the hospital, but she also started helping with the foundation. It wasn't something she had planned. But once she saw how serious he was about making a difference, she agreed. Together, they started visiting small clinics and children's centers, helping provide supplies, training, and better equipment. Every time they went somewhere together, people noticed how differently he behaved around her. He wasn't the distant, commanding businessman people were used to. Around her, he listened, smiled more often, and even laughed sometimes. Rumors began to spread, of course. People loved stories that connected wealth and heroism, but neither of them paid attention. What they had wasn't about fame or money. It was built on gratitude, understanding, and quiet respect. One afternoon, they were visiting a children's hospital outside the city. After the meetings, they sat on a bench outside, watching the kids play in the courtyard. His son was there too, chasing a balloon and laughing so loudly that even strangers smiled watching him. He's really happy, Lily said softly. He is, the man replied, his eyes following his son. Every time I see him laugh, I think about that day. And I still can't believe he's here. Lily glanced at him. You should stop reliving that moment. You did nothing wrong. Accidents happen. He looked at her and smiled faintly. You know, you've said that before. But it's easier to say than to believe. I've lived my life fixing problems with logic and money. But that day, none of it could save him. Only a stranger's courage did. Lily shook her head gently. It wasn't courage. It was instinct. If I had thought about it, maybe I wouldn't have done it. But I just didn't think. That's exactly what makes it courage, he said quietly. There was silence for a moment, broken only by the sound of laughter from the courtyard. Then he said something that caught her off guard. You know, my son calls you his guardian. Lily turned to him, surprised. What? He says you're his guardian angel. He told his teachers that a kind lady from the fire came to save him. Her eyes softened. That's very sweet. It is, he said. And sometimes I think he's right. Lily didn't know how to respond to that. Her throat felt tight, and she looked away to hide the emotion in her eyes. The months that followed brought them closer. Not in the way people might expect, but in something quieter, more meaningful. They shared stories, dreams, and memories. She learned how much he'd changed since that day, how he spent more time with his son, took breaks from work, and started caring about things beyond business, and he learned that Lily, despite her quiet nature, carried her own strength. She had lost her parents young, worked her way through school, and spent her life serving others. She never complained, never asked for help, and yet always gave everything she could in her. He found a reminder of what mattered most in life. One evening, a year after the accident, the foundation held a charity event. It wasn't a fancy gala. It was a simple gathering to raise funds for a new children's wing at the hospital. Lily stood on the stage, nervous but composed, as she shared her story. She didn't talk about the fire or the rescue in dramatic detail. She spoke about kindness, about moments when we have to choose between walking away and stepping forward. The crowd listened in silence. Some people wiped away tears. When she finished, everyone stood and applauded. From the front row, he watched her with pride. His son sat beside him, clapping his small hands, smiling wide. After the event, he walked up to her. "You were amazing," he said simply. "I was terrified." She laughed softly. "You didn't look it," she smiled at him. "Thank you. For everything." He shook his head. "No, Lily, thank you. You changed more lives than you realize, including mine." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by people, but somehow it felt like the world had gone still again, like it had that night in the hospital. Later that evening, when the guests had left, They walked outside together. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and the cool breeze carried the faint sound of music from a nearby street. He looked up at the stars and said quietly, "It's strange how life works, isn't it? One moment changes everything." Lily nodded, her eyes following the sky. "Sometimes the hardest moments are the ones that bring us where we're meant to be." He smiled at her words. "You really believe that?" "I do," she said softly. "Because I've seen it." He nodded slowly, as if letting her words sink in. Then they both turned their gaze back to the stars, silent, peaceful, and full of gratitude for the life that had been given a second chance. And somewhere in that quiet night, beneath the same sky that had watched their paths cross through fire and fate, they both knew that courage, kindness, and one selfless choice had changed their worlds forever.